Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Safety Institute of Australia webinar. Today's discussion is an overview of developing return to work and health strategies. We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Jeanette Kinahan. This webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to participate by posting questions to the presenter, which can be typed into the chat box located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. All questions will be answered throughout the presentation. If you are experiencing difficulty hearing the sound during the webinar, please dial the 1-800 support number listed in the chat box. I'd now like to pass you over to Jeanette to begin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about this topic, developing return to work and health strategy. Just a reminder that this is an overview, so it'll be a fairly high-level presentation, and it is based on course material from the Personal Injury Education Foundation. And for some of you, this may be validation for your current practices. For others, it may be a reminder of some of the basics that we all know and include in our practices. And for others, it may be food for thought to include in future practice. So I'll get underway and work my way through. Please feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Okay, so I wanted to start off today just giving you an outline of the three areas that I'm going to cover and weave through today's presentation. And the first one is a reminder of the importance of workplace planning to support recovery and return to work, and then talk about the components of a return to work and health strategy and developing a return to work and health strategy lastly. And just a reminder as well that this is a fairly high-level overview, because anyone who works in this area would know that we could spend a long time talking about each of these three areas in detail. So why do we place an emphasis on strategic planning to support recovery and return to work? Most of the time, as we would know, most injuries and illnesses resolve over time, given that they are correctly diagnosed, there is appropriate treatment, and generally it's fairly straightforward and people will progress through a predictable path. A small percentage, for a small percentage, and it is a small percentage of people who do become injured or unwell, either at work or at home. For some people, their condition does become chronic, and protracted recovery time occurs, and along the way return to work can be problematic. So the development of a management strategy or a plan, which is really what strategy is about, is important for minimising the risk associated with protracted recovery time. We do know additionally that good work is good for us. The health benefits of good work is well publicised now since the 2008 study from Carol Black, where there was significant evidence to show us that worklessness has negative consequences for health, both physical health and mental health, and there is a generational impact from worklessness, not just an economic impact. So we do know that good work is good for us, and this has become the foundation stone for the emphasis on supporting people to return to work and to consider work as part of their recovery strategy. So if we just take a quick look at the injury and illness risk in the Australian population, it puts into perspective some of the business case around why we would emphasise developing return to work and health strategy. So from a workers' compensation claims cost, I was at a WorkSafe briefing last week, and so these figures are fairly recent, that on average a physical injury will cost $8,000 and 5 weeks of lost time, and a mental injury, $22,000 and 13.3 weeks of lost time. And cumulative across Australia, that's $10.9 billion in lost productivity. So it's a significant impact for organisations, for the Australian economy and the community. And additionally, we're talking about the financial impacts, but the human cost associated with that is also enormous. Apart from workers' compensation, we know that sick leave, other sorts of leave, carers leave when you're caring for family members, lost productivity due to presenteeism, and employee attrition rates are high in Australia. So having a plan or an approach that is predetermined in the workplace, the support and assistance available to people, is very important. And more often than not these days, I would be involved in organisations where they would provide support and assistance for non-work-related injuries in the same way as they would for work-related injury and illness, because of the impact of absence and the associated impacts of having to replace valuable people in the workforce. So the types of matters that I would become involved with these days previously would have been, physical or mental injuries related to work, and now they would also include chronic health, the impact of chronic health conditions or chronic mental ill health, acute injuries, the likes of people struggling to maintain themselves in the work following a cancer diagnosis, and the more serious mental health illnesses that occur. So, it has become the focus or the emphasis on returning people to work has become broader than just workers' compensation injuries. The Institute for Health and Welfare in Australia estimates that 2/3 of the burden of disease in Australia is due to the 5 disease groups listed there. So you can see that injury and illness related to the work that we do is just one aspect of the burden of disease that impacts organisations. And 1 in 5 Australians have a disability, and 1 in 3 have severe or profound limitation. And I term that my work is about maintaining and supporting ability in the workplace, regardless of the basis upon which it has been challenged. So the components of a return to work and health strategy, and it's really interesting that the language previously with return to work was purely about return to work, and recovery in terms of a return to health was secondary, whereas essentially with health promotion becoming more dominant in the workplace, returning to work and returning to health and returning to the community are the goals of these types of strategies. So a return to work and health strategy is basically an action plan, and the components of that action plan really have to look at managing, monitoring and responding appropriately and effectively to an injured or ill person's recovery and their progress towards a return to work. So there's 4 main components of the strategy: the goals and objectives, identifying barriers and implementing actions to address those barriers, and monitoring progress. So let's take a closer look at some of these. So essentially in formulating goals and objectives, it is helpful, or it's essential, to understand the injury or the illness that the person is experiencing, And understanding the likely prognosis along with expected timeframes, recovery benchmarks, normative recovery benchmarks are available, and standard treatment regimens for common injuries and illnesses. Means you can develop realistic objective goals. It's important that you have access to medical information, and typically that underscores the importance of collaborating with health practitioners the person has chosen, and other resources that you can refer to when developing your strategy. And as well as referring to normative recovery times and the types of generic information we know about certain types of injuries and illnesses, taking into consideration the person's individual circumstances is really the hand in the glove aspect of understanding how that particular illness or injury is impacting that particular individual. Typically, goals are aligned to returning the person to their pre-injury or suitable employment on the way through in a safe, timely and sustainable manner. And suitable employment typically involves an assessment of a range of factors, not just the person's physical capacity, but their work history, the skills that they have, their age, their language abilities, the amount of hours that they can do, whether they can travel to and from the workplace, whether they can work on their own or need to be supervised, whether they're taking medication that impacts their ability to work with machinery. So there's a lot of factors to be taken into consideration in respect to suitable employment. And where return to pre-injury duties is not possible, then we look to returning people to work that involves their maximum functional capacity. And once again, that is known in consultation with the person's health practitioners. And unfortunately, in some instances where there is serious or catastrophic illness or injury, return to work may not be possible, and the goal switches to returning people to independence to the extent that is possible, and also return to the community and engagement in community activities. Somebody has asked me a question asking me to exemplify recovery benchmarks. And there are a number of different sources of normative recovery benchmarks that are available. And if people would like those references, I can provide them to follow the webinar. But essentially, for example, they would outline that an uncomplicated fracture of the arm or the leg would require a period of plaster for 6 weeks, and then potentially some physio to follow, and a full recovery would be expected in 12 weeks. And that would be a very simplified version of what a recovery benchmark would look like. And there's a vast range of recovery benchmarks based on the typical progress from injury or illness to recovery. So if I move along now to barriers, and focusing on barriers is very, very critical, because it is in understanding the barriers that as professionals we can identify and address and overcome in consultation and collaboration with the injured person and the health practitioner, we can overcome those barriers in terms of resolving any barriers to return to work. And once again, if we reflect on the nature of risk, there are certain risks or certain expressions of risk that we know are challenges to return to work, and in identifying those and putting in interventions to address them is part of developing and monitoring your strategies. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of or referenced or looked to the biopsychosocial flags model, and that model identifies factors that are known to impede recovery and independence. And and typically when we are developing return to work and health strategies, and we are speaking with the injured or ill person and their health practitioners and others that may be involved in their care, such as family members or friends, we are looking for those biopsychosocial flags as prompts to consider whether there is an aspect of the strategy that needs to consider one or more of these factors. And I was at a conference last year that introduced the concept of biopsychosocial techno flags, in that a lot of our work these days involves technology, and there are particular flags that would revolve around technology that may be a barrier to recovery and return to work. And so I haven't seen that translate into the literature in terms of the flags model changing, but it is certainly something that as a practitioner in this area, as more and more of employment involves interacting with technology in some way, it does impact return to work strategies and suitable employment options in terms of how technologically proficient or literate a person may be, and their ability to use technology in their return to work or in their employment. So the biopsychosocial flags model is one of the primary models used for developing return to work and health strategies and monitoring these strategies. And in fact, when working with organisations, I would develop a similar model based on the risks inherent in their particular workplace. So this model provides standard situations that can pose barriers or risks, and I always recommend that organisations develop their own risk matrix based on the known experience of injury and illness in your particular organisation, and very much according to your particular the occupation in your organisation. So the actual work that people are required to do. So, if we move on now to have a look at the biopsychosocial flags model, it's essentially suggesting that that there are biological, psychosocial, personal factors, and environmental factors that can provide barriers to returning to work and indeed to recovery. And if we take red flags as the most serious pathology and comorbidity, for example, comorbidity would refer to perhaps somebody who has a physical injury at the workplace but has an underlying mental health condition, or any other comorbid condition that will impact recovery. And typically that would be a psychological factors, but it could be more personal factors, what's going on at home, what other medical conditions that the person has that may impact or delay recovery. Yellow flags, and these are more the personal factors, unhelpful beliefs about pain or their injury, unhelpful coping strategies, and sometimes these are person-driven. Sometimes they are driven by health practitioners, and other times they are driven by family and friends, and they are not helpful, and the person is often torn between what they may be being told by professionals, but what they would be experiencing at home. And for some people, a family member may view that returning to work while their arm or a limb is in plaster would be contraindicated. We would be helping the person to return to work even in plaster where it was medically feasible and safe to do so, which potentially puts them in conflict with loved ones. Emotional distress, the extent to which an injured person is emotionally reacting to their injury, and at times that can, just as with a pain experience, that can seem disproportionate to the injury itself. Excuse me. People who take a passive role in their recovery, overly solicitous carers, perceived low social support at work. Relationships at work are a significant indicator as to whether somebody will be wanting to come back to work quickly, or whether this may be delayed or even indeed at risk, and particularly relationships with their manager or their supervisor. The low job satisfaction is another risk factor, and a perception of excessive demands. So the workplace can feel like a hostile environment, and particularly in, for example, if somebody was experiencing work stress and they felt that their supervisor had not been supportive, which had in fact heightened their emotional distress. They might be some of the typical scenarios. And interestingly, what's not there, but what we know to be a risk is whether the person has a history of absence, including previous workers' compensation claims. Often the injured worker themselves is the best predictor of their own return to work, and it's a necessary question right up front to ask the person themselves how they feel their recovery and progress towards return to work is progressing, and responding appropriately with intervention strategies if that outlook is pessimistic. And of course, other environmental factors. Legislation around compensation can influence a person's incentives to return to work, particularly if they're receiving their full salary. The type or the nature of the workplace, if it's heavy work or dangerous work, then it may mean that the person or their health practitioners are reluctant to return somebody into that environment. and if the person feels under threat in terms of their financial security. So these are some of the known risks, and they've been grouped as flags, and when we tend to think in conversation with injured or ill people and their health practitioners, as in that conversation, these are the types of things that return to work practitioners will be listening for and asking questions to elicit attitudes towards some of these factors. And it is, I tend to think quite literally in terms of, a flag will go off when any of these factors arise in the conversations that I'm having. And once there are multiple flags, then that also may dictate a more active interventionist strategy. So just on that, this is where I was referring to also including the types of risks that are inherent in your workplace based on your own risk profile, the experience of absence and injury and illness that you have, and the types of injury and illness that occur in your workplace, physical or mental health injury, and developing a risk matrix similar to the biopsychosocial flags model, and including the flags from this model, is the basis upon which you would view any injury or illness that came to your attention in the organisation. And even a seemingly minor incident you may respond to in ways that are more interventionist based on the risk profile that you have developed. And it is a mainstay of workplace injury management strategies in that it may dictate when and if you involve other support mechanisms in the organisation, or when and if you implement your return to work strategies. So your risk matrix, along with the biopsychosocial flags, are a great basis upon which to keep a surveillance on incidents and injuries that are occurring, and they form the basis upon which you have targeted responses. Okay, so actions when you're developing your return to work and health strategy should be very targeted with a clear purpose and reflect the main issues or barriers identified as risks. So we've talked about the types of risks in the biopsychosocial flags. We know we add to that the risks that you've identified in your workplace and your work population, and then we add to that what we know from the injured worker, the injured or unwell person, and their health practitioners, and that then from there flows the types of actions that we will need to put into place to support the person's recovery and return to work. And the key is to ensure that they are outcome focused and timely. And that means that we need to, that means that when there is new information that comes to hand, because information recovery will evolve over time and risks will not materialise or indeed emerge over time, and we need to be in a position to modify or adjust the strategy accordingly. So monitoring is another core component of developing strategies. Any plan or any strategy is only as effective as the commitment to monitor and review it. So as time passes and the person participates in their treatment or not, and the issues or challenges that the person may be experiencing with treatment and recovery change and evolve, it is necessary to review the management strategy and plan to address those changes. If a person has a workers' compensation claim or indeed is under the care of a health practitioner, usually a review might be triggered when there is a new certificate or when they are reviewed by their health practitioner. If they're not under the care of a health practitioner, the interval for reviewing a plan would be based upon the goals of the plan. And in some cases where where a person's recovery and return to work is very dynamic, that might be weekly, because the strategy may look to transition a person gradually. However, based on a person's concerns or anxieties around returning to work, and then once they're at work and comfortable in their work environment again, the strategy may evolve more quickly. And so being flexible to events or changes that occur is very important. Typically, a return to work plan would have at a minimum a monthly review. If each of the weeks within that plan, for example, might identify a graduated increase in hours and duties, and then the review would involve everybody regrouping and discussing progress and then planning for the next period. And sometimes, depending if it's a workers' compensation claim, the particular jurisdiction may dictate matters around formal return to work planning and the timeliness of that. And they can also be matters for your organisation to consider. But the important, I would underline the importance of being proactive and monitoring and reviewing plans when new information is received or changes in a person's circumstances arise. And if that happens weekly, then the plan is reviewed weekly. If it's something that is evolving over time, then longer periods between reviews are appropriate. And that's not to say that there isn't informal review happening on a weekly or, if necessary, daily basis in the workplace, either through the supervisor or through the return to work coordinator or the support person in the organisation, even in passing in the corridor or you know, a conversation, the are you okay, how are you going conversation, just touching base. And so they are the more informal day-to-day type monitoring and review activities. And then the formal monitoring and review is more that would consider involving health practitioners and reviewing the documentation around employment. So if we move on now to developing a return to work and health strategy. So this really just overviews the main steps here, and I can't emphasize enough the need for consultation and collaboration. And in fact, I have over the years thought of the main activities associated with developing work and health strategies in terms of 5 C's. Control, It has to come from the top in terms of the support the organisation provides for injured or ill people in the organisation, determining whether or not you're supporting people who have work-related injuries and illnesses only, or whether you also are going to provide the same level of support and assistance with for people with non-work-related illness or injury. So control of the program, coordination. Somebody has to coordinate these activities and be responsible and accountable for driving them in the organisation. Communication is at the heart of everything that we do. As human beings, we are relationship-based, and communication at these times is very important, and the quality of communication can influence cooperation, compassion, providing support and assistance without judgment, without blame, and with compassion and concern as a human being is the basis on which my career has been successful. And collaboration. Not one person can, not one person alone is responsible for the support and assistance in the workplace. Collaborating with health practitioners and the injured person themselves is essential. So obtaining relevant medical and rehabilitation information in relation to the injured or ill person, such as their capacity for work, the type of restrictions that might apply for their return to work, and what sort of support needs that they may have is essential. Supporting recovery and making sure that the injured person has the type of resources that they need for their recovery is vital in gaining trust and cooperation. Establishing return to work goals and gaining agreement for them with the person, the injured or ill person, and the health practitioner and the organisation. To what extent will the organisation provide suitable employment, and on what basis is that suitable employment provided? Assessing the workplace and identifying suitable duties. So once again, that requires consideration of whether you have the skill and capability to do that yourself, or whether you need to obtain expert assistance, such as a rehabilitation provider, an OT, an ergonomist, and the level of expertise that you may require will depend upon the type of work and the work environment that the person is looking to return to. Does the workplace need to be modified? Does the person require modified equipment or tools in order to be able to resume their pre-injury employment, or indeed suitable alternate employment? Developing and documenting a plan that can be agreed, signed off, and distributed, so everybody is very clear about what is expected, including the worker, and importantly, what the person cannot do and should not be asked to do. Identifying barriers and being very proactive about addressing those barriers. For example, if in the assessment phase you identify that relationships with the person, between the person and their supervisor, are fraught, that there may have been conflict, the supervisor may not be supportive of the injured person. If it is that you're wanting to return the person to that area, then the relationship with the supervisor might be a barrier, and it may be that you may have to facilitate a conversation to discuss any difficulties in the relationship and resolve them. It may be that there is some coaching that's required for the supervisor in terms of their responsibilities and accountability within the organisation, overarching policies and procedures with care and support for injured or ill employees. So barriers, identifying barriers and implementing proactive strategies is a constant process that return to work coordinators will engage with. And there are times where that feels like you're doing that right up until the moment the person steps into the workplace and beyond. As the return to work progresses, there may be psychosocial barriers or difficulties. There might be relationship difficulties. There might be difficulties with the tools that are required for the job, or the equipment, or the work processes. So being constantly vigilant around challenges or issues and concerns and addressing them proactively is vital. And of course, managing workplace support services such as rehabilitation providers, engaging mediators or conflict resolution specialists if there are relationship difficulties, and with sometimes with mental health injuries, it is conflict or relationship difficulties that are at the heart of the injury or illness that the person is experiencing. You can see here that there are a significant number of stakeholder groups involved with ensuring return to work and health following an illness or injury. And engaging effectively with each one is essential. There is, engaging with the case manager or of the insurer at times, the employer, the return to work coordinator, the OC health and safety coordinator, and line managers. It may be necessary to engage each and every one of those. And as an external consultant, that is quite a typical profile when I'm involved with these matters. The scheme, of course, the injured person engages with the scheme. There are regulations and legislation, obligations and responsibilities that come along associated with workers' compensation claims. The injured person will be engaging with their work colleagues or teams, and there are times when, even when the person's not at work, that their support becomes vital in keeping the person engaged with the prospect of returning to work. The injured person's family, their spouse, their children, their friends, they all have an impact on the person's attitude to return to work and recovery. There are times when there are legal advisors involved. If the person is in dispute with their insurer or their policy, there may be conciliation and other bodies that become involved. And of course, service providers, treatment providers, rehabilitation providers, conflict and dispute resolvers. So depending on where you sit in those stakeholder groups, you may or may not have contact with each of the other stakeholder groups. But often the injured person will be having contact with each of those groups. And we know through research that simply having a compensation claim can negatively impact a person's recovery and return to work. So we know that the injured person is navigating this very complex system that looks so simple represented on paper. And that's basically the overview that I wanted to talk about today, because I wanted to leave time for questions and interaction with everybody who's online today. So if you've got any questions, please send them in. If it's not something I can answer, I'm sure there's somebody else on the line today that might be able to answer your question. Oh, we have another one here. Okay, this question is quite a long one, so bear with me. Who is the owner of the return to work strategy in an organisation? OC physician, HR advisor, or work health safety advisor? Well, that will vary depending upon the organisation. Legislation requires organisations of a certain size to have thought about these questions and planned for them in terms of appointing a return to work coordinator. And return to work coordinators often report to occupational health and safety coordinators. And ultimately, these strategies form parts of policies and procedures that are developed for the whole of organisation, and therefore come from the top, from the CEO. Board directors have responsibility for health and safety, and ultimately return to work and health strategies fall under that as well. So, you know, there are multiple owners of a return to work strategy, but from the injured person's perspective, they will be often dealing directly with somebody with the designation of return to work coordinator or injury management coordinator in the organisation. This question goes on to ask, what are the return to work strategy or plan monitoring tools? And once again, they are, there's the documentation that sits around some of these matters can be determined by specific legislative requirements, such as return to work plans or return to work arrangements, they are known by in some organisations, and that will set out the minimum expectations, and then organisations will customise these documents according to their internal needs. So that the tools associated with that will vary. Another question is, what is the level of liability or involvement of an organisation against an employee that is seriously injured or ill, in particular regarding gaining independence and returning to the community? Are there any legal aspects for an employer to ensure the injured person gains independence and returns to community? Well, yes, once again, the legislation in various jurisdictions, and if it's a transport accident claim, or if it is a personal injury claim through a personal injury policy, that they will dictate the extent to which an employer has a financial liability. And of course, that doesn't set aside any moral liability or organisational focus on caring and supporting for employees. So the length of time an employer is required to hold open employment, for example, will be dictated by legislation in most cases, and that will vary according to the jurisdiction that the injury or the claim sits within. Is there a standard practice in the industry for employers to select a certain profile when recruiting to return to work coordinators? Any preferred background or skills and qualification? Absolutely. And that will vary depending on the risk profile that you have within your organisation. Clearly, the greater the risks in the organisation, the greater number of injuries or incidents or illnesses, the more experienced return to work coordinator you may need. And there's a lot of great material produced in the various workers' compensation jurisdictions about the characteristics of return to work coordinators that will assist employers. So yes, there's a lot of guidance material available on the websites of the health and safety regulators around the duties the duties for return to work coordinators, and therefore the type of background and experience you may want to consider when employing a return to work coordinator. Another question here, how do we tackle the culture of not completing a mental health claim due to stigma, fear of rejection? Yes, and that really speaks to the culture of the organisation, where and for organisations, destigmatising mental health it creates an environment where people will feel free to come forward and self-identify that they may be experiencing a mental ill health, or such as depression or anxiety, or indeed may be experiencing symptoms of workplace stress. And so creating that environment in an organisation is vital. Another aspect where organisations will assist employees commonly is having an employee assistance program, so that people who may not want to come forward can still access support from a counsellor for any issue or concern that they may have. And in those conversations, they may then feel that they are able to self-identify and talk to their organisation. From the work that I do, I know that for organisations, becoming very proactive in promoting positive mental health, it also shines a light on the other side of the coin around mental ill health. And by having conversations and promoting positive mental health, a mentally healthy workplace, it enables people to have the conversations around mental ill health and destigmatizes mental ill health and enables people to come forward in ways where they know that they'll be supported compassionately. There's another question here. There seems to be a growing trend for GPs to advise workers not to submit a claim for work-related mental ill health. That is disappointing if that's something that you're experiencing in your particular area. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that many employers are choosing to support people whether they have a work-related injury or not, and indeed whether there is a workers' compensation claim or not. And typically that's where those employers would also provide support and assistance to somebody who may self-identify that they are experiencing mental health challenges, but they don't want to put in a mental ill health injury claim. And a person is not obligated to put in a claim for workers' compensation. And in organisations that support people, whether there is a claim or not, employers will typically extend some support for obtaining counselling, either through the EAP program or through other mechanisms, or in fact seeking the services of a psychologist. So the workplace is changing in terms of becoming more supportive and providing more assistance for people who self-identify as having challenges or concerns relating to their work ability. And supervisors play a role in providing surveillance within the workplace and asking the question of people. And it is as simple as asking the "Are you okay?" question, and then being available to encourage people to seek further support and assistance when and if they need to. There are certain occupations that where reluctance to put in a claim, or in fact even to seek medical support, is difficult, and certainly, you know, it is, believe it or not, it is difficult for some people working in the health profession to seek assistance for mental ill health because they have concerns about what that may mean for their health practitioner license and registration. So it is a very complex. It can be a very complex space, and there's lots of reasons why somebody may not put in a workers' compensation claim, or indeed self-identify as having an issue or concern for their mental well-being. But there is increasingly opportunity for people to discuss their concerns through employee assistance programs and talk through some of these, talk through their concerns in a way that can help them clarify what their next step might be. So I hope that answers that question. I'm just going to check if there's any other questions. I think that's everyone's questions now. Please let me know if that isn't, but I think that answers all the questions now. And are there any last minute questions? Because I know that we're coming up to our finishing time, and I want to say thank you so much for coming along this afternoon and taking time out of your day. And I wish you well for the work that you are doing. And if it's in this space, encourage you to work with care and compassion. So if there are any other questions, no, I think, Jeff, that's the last question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeanette, for your presentation, and thank you to all other participants for attending today's webinar. Please stay logged in to take our online survey, which you'll be redirected to in a moment. We thank you in advance for your feedback and wish you a pleasant afternoon.